Light, camera, action. Today we have an amazing, iconic guest, Jonathan Gray, entertainment lawyer, filmmaker, producer, storyteller, gambler, and amazing singer. And
I finger paint and glue things as well, Charlie.
So I want to start because I like to start engaging with the idea of the journey. You have been many shapes as an entertainment lawyer and then on to becoming a producer, but you began and are known to many with some of the mythology, and also the reality is that you are both an entertainment law firm but also housing a post-production entity, and that sort of centered and kind of created an atmosphere of a kind of an incubator and a place where people gather and artists gather and all of that. So take me right to the center of the shape of your firm and the way things kind of converged with the story to start off with, just because I think it's interesting of how Brian Devine and Gigantic came together with it, and then we can move and kind of span out into the whole world.
Sure.
Of Ray Krause.
I will say with a little bit of tongue in cheek that I never refer to myself as an entertainment lawyer. It sounds too much like chiropractor, like I'm a doctor, not not really a doctor. I got my start, Charlie, as a trial lawyer back in 1990, and made my way into entertainment with that path initially as an intellectual property litigator, and had studied avant-garde cinema. I went to a couple of different schools, but I studied with Ken Jacobs, and who's a pretty sort of iconic avant-garde filmmaker, and studied the works of Stan Brakhage and Kenneth Anger. So I was always sort of on this film path, and spent the first 4 or 5 years of my career as a trial lawyer. Nothing sexy, representing manufacturers and maintainers of elevators and escalators and material handling systems and forklifts. And at some point, 1995, I was so itching to just make a movie and align myself with my oldest friend Michael Clancy, and we made a short film which sort of set this whole path in motion. The first short film that I made was called Emily's Last Date, which premiered at Sundance in 1996. This goes back a while, and that sort of paved the path for me. It was my first experience at Sundance. I've been there every year since. I think this is 28 or 29 coming up, assuming there is a Sundance. And at some point realized that I could actually combine the two and work in the field where my passion was, and my efforts over the next couple of years were really how to sort of weasel my way into doing film, into doing film work. Brian Devine, who you mentioned, who's the grand poobah and principal of the Gigantic universe, Gigantic Pictures and Gigantic Studios, I met initially as his lawyer back in 94, 95, and we became brothers right from the get-go, and we're plotting right from the outset to how we could combine our worlds. And the post facility that you referred to, the genesis of that really came together based upon this desire to bring community together, which you referred to. I've never worked in a business, and I'm 25 years into the film and television business, that was so community oriented and so collaboratively oriented. And boy, Charlie, not getting out ahead, and I know we'll come back. Owning the post, is such a part of the game, and Brian and his wonderful team have not only brought their creative capital to the table, but Brian has built a universe that is really state of the art in terms of the post process, and he's got a production services company as well. So the whole concept that led to this facility I'm in, and we'll take a little tour later, was really rooted in community and the acknowledgement that bringing folks together. In a world that they feel safe, and that you have the resources to be able to actually advance, things in the production world, was essential, to the process. And that's what we, in broad strokes, what we, managed to put together over a lot of years. Brian and I have been, partners in crime, really since, over 20 years at this point.
And you created that in a smaller sense to start off with in Soho when you first converged.
Yeah.
He was still sort of developing the idea of gigantic music before it became what it would become. So is that how you started to deal with Brian with his first label? Because Gigantic Music then became Gigantic Pictures, then
Yeah.
became Gigantic Post, and it became its own world, and then grew once you moved to Chelsea, where you are today.
We really grew up together in in that world, and one person that bears mentioning probably more than anyone is Bruce Meyerson, who has been my business partner since the get-go. When I decided to make a change, from being a trial lawyer into the entertainment business, which not coincidentally was actually the right when my father passed. It's that sort of glass ceiling sort of broke, and I said, you know what, I got to do what I want to do. And the first call I made was to Bruce, because there was nobody that I trusted and continue to trust more than Bruce. And we really, set out together, both to put together the law practice, Bruce from the business perspective, and to start, sort of building up this dream of having I wouldn't say a film studio, but being able to have the resources to be able to facilitate, harbor, and enable, filmmakers to make their movies. And that started down on Broome Street, which I stumbled into at this moment that I decided to make a change, and I am a blessed person. I stumbled into a space on Broome Street, which I know you recall.
Yeah.
5,000 square feet on Broome between Worcester and Green. The space was that I moved into was a jingle house that was run by Michael Clancy, who I mentioned before, his in-laws, and they were getting ready to retire and had 5,000 square feet. 16-foot ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows. I'm going to hate myself even for saying this, for $3,750 a month. So I stepped into an absolute dream situation and built from there. With the Levinsons, who ran Double L Music at the time, to be able to build out this dream. And that whole process was I sort of became a weekend warrior building out the space. If you remember all the cubicles and so on.
Oh yeah.
And we brought in producers and .comers, and this is, bear in mind, the late '90s, and started building the community right then. And it wasn't just having a huge space, which was an absolute blessing, but I was I'll say kind of self-servingly smart enough to bring in a post guy who had an Avid, and you remember those days, Charlie, like the friend and favor rate for the Avid room was $2,500 a week back then.
Crazy, I remember.
Now for $2,500, you buy the laptop, the software, and rent a basement in Brooklyn. You've got an editing suite. So the world changed a lot, but we had everything under one roof back then. And not to ramble on too much, but part of what built the community, and I know you know this well, was having parties and having social events and having rap parties and launch parties and script read parties. And part of it is because, I kind of have the host gene, but it was a wonderful opportunity to bring, all kind of great folks together, including you, Charlie, and to bring those communities together, which wasn't just film and television, but, the fine art community. And I mentioned the .com world, pseudo.com, and, sort of was part of my life back then, if anyone recalls Pseudo. And it really became a sort of an incubator for a lot of creative folks. And again, I forgive the redundancy, having those creative folks in that incubator and all this wonderful creative, capital and collaborative, spirit work much better having the post there as well, and having the physical resources and the infrastructure to be able to support advancing these dreams. Yeah,
absolutely. And for me, if you go out into the world, I mean, I have to think of, your colleagues, or the community of attorneys that represent talent. You're one of a kind. There's no one else doing what you do, right? In terms of, representing,
I appreciate you for
counsel, as well as doing this sort of community, creative community, and also a place where people can finish their work and walk across the hall and talk to their attorney about their deal.
I think it is a unique setup. Certainly having a a law office for, for the last 25 years that has a post-production, facility is I think an extraordinarily unique, situation. When I, going back to when I first, got into entertainment law, was the same time that I decided to produce my first, short back in '95. And, I really had not only no familiarity with the entertainment law business per se, I didn't really have too many, connections. So I reached out to a friend who sent me some, pro forma documents that I could use for a lawyer friend for the short. And Charlie, like the location agreement that they sent me, which was kind of them to share the documents with me, was a Disney or a Viacom like 22-page location agreement that I looked at, and it was just like bewildering. The only thing that location agreement would do would be to diminish the likelihood that you could actually secure a location, because nobody, at a gas station on a highway is going to sign a 22-page location agreement. And it occurred to me then, just common sense, frankly, that I could accomplish in those 22 pages, what they accomplished in those 22 pages in a page. It's not because I'm brilliant. It's because there's a practicality to doing things that sometimes the law business, kind of takes you astray from. It ain't that complicated. So when I saw that, I was so frustrated that it put a fire under me to get more involved in the entertainment law community. And I managed to, and thanks to my sister, quite frankly, the way I got into entertainment law, my sister, who was a massage therapist back in the mid-90s, met a very prominent entertainment lawyer named Phil Cowan, who was a client of hers in the massage therapy world. I don't know, I'm not sure if you know this story. And she was all excited because she knew I wanted to get into entertainment, and she had a big shot client, and she said, I'll introduce you to him. And I said, you know what, let's think about this a little bit. I had already started going to film festivals, Telluride and Sundance in particular. And I just got back from Telluride. I said, you know what, don't say anything, but next time you go to Massage Phil, wear the Telluride Film Festival t-shirt that I got you, and let's see what happens. And sure enough, Phil started the conversation and said, oh, you went to Telluride? No, my brother did. What does your brother do? He's a lawyer. I'd love to meet him. So I told Phil ultimately that I had set him up. And that's sort of what got the ball rolling. And the way this all started was at a card table. Phil Cowan was not only a brilliant lawyer and the president of the Copyright Society, he was also a two-time world champion bridge player. And although I'm not a bridge player, as you know, I'm the son of a professional gambler. I grew up in casinos, my whole life. I was born not with a silver spoon, but with a deck of cards in my hands. Phil was a much better card player, but I was a much better drinker. So we hung out, at his fancy apartment on Central Park West, played a game called Hearts, which is very similar to bridge, and I managed to beat him at his own game, which happened like 1 out of 10 times. But that was how I met Phil. And before the evening was over, we were trying to sort out a deal for me to work for his firm, and that's how I got into entertainment law from the outset. And being in that position at the firm, Cowan, Debates, and Abrams and Shepard, they're still around. Steve Shepard, who's a mentor of mine, is now my lawyer. I had a place to operate from, and I was able to quickly, make my way, to having a position with the Bar Association. One of the lawyers there, Tim Debates, had some high position in the Bar Association. And I pitched him on the idea of putting together like an independent motion picture committee. And he said, that's a great idea. Who's going to head it? And I said, well, I'll be the chairperson of it. So I managed within about, a month of being in the entertainment business to have set up and kind of appointed myself as the chairperson of the New York State Bar Association Committee on Motion Picture and Television. And that was my sort of, foundation intro, to being an entertainment lawyer. And I just really wanted to tell these lawyers that there was a better way of doing it. So I would have panel discussions and basically bring on filmmakers to tell lawyers how they were not doing their job properly, which didn't go over that well with the Bar Association. But frankly, I really didn't care, because these lawyers needed to hear that they needed to have a better understanding of how things work. And guess what? A 22-page location agreement on a low-budget independent film doesn't work. And you can accomplish the same thing in 2 pages, written in English. So I'd like to think that, the foundation of building the practice that I was privileged to build was based upon practical stuff and being able to communicate with my clients. Not every entertainment lawyer or film lawyer needs to have produced a film, but boy, it helps to have made the mistakes and learn from them. So the whole foundation of this is really practical, is really, understanding, what it means to make a movie, and then figuring out how lawyers can serve that part of it. I'm not just saying that, you're not here to serve the lawyers. The lawyers are here to serve you, So I know I'm veering a little bit off course here, but, the whole, basis for, sitting in the seat today has been, wanting to be involved in film and being able to effectively facilitate, the process. And God knows, with all the great people, that I've been able to surround myself with, and that includes you, Charlie. I'm going to get weepy eyed. I'm playing with my heroes, Charlie, and it's a great blessing, but let's move on before I cry.
Absolutely. I personally, not to dive into gambling, but I love it. And I love the relationship that you have with it, not only because you're your dad, but also because of your knowledge. And I think let's face it, being a filmmaker, a producer, is a gamble.
Yeah.
And you're not only a representing factor of all of that, and a pioneer in what you do, but also with a tremendous foundation in the process and the psychology and the skill of gambling.
It is a unique background to have coming into this business. And I will say, Charlie, that my father was a professional gambler. I say that with the acknowledgement that being a professional gambler is tantamount to being a professional smack addict in certain regard, because it is a compulsive disorder that is a different and longer conversation. My father was a mathematician in many respects. So, the manner in which, I won't spend too much time on the gambling, but, the manner in which, that was approached. For example, I played professional blackjack for years. I supported my law habit as a professional gambler for many years. It's a funny way to say it, but, the gambling in that regard is just numbers. A very well-trained monkey could play professional blackjack. It's just numbers, and figuring out how you can get that very small marginal edge, and then sticking with the game plan and playing perfect blackjack and good money management and counting cards, which is actually pretty easy. All that comes together. So it's not just, putting money on the pass line and crossing your fingers. There's a lot of math that goes into playing, effectively, because otherwise you're just throwing your money away. Now that does apply to the film business. It is an incredibly risky business, but to be clear, in the film business, almost even more so than the gambling business, having an understanding of all the variables, whether they be financial or talent variables, which are all over the place, and how that all comes together, there is absolutely a science to it that needs to work with the creative side of it. And sort of right back to the lawyers who may be at that table, facilitating the process. The lawyering, again, it's almost sort of, being able to effectively bridge that space between the tires and the road. You know what I mean? If the tires are is the film and the road is the financier, there needs to be, some individual or individuals that are able to make all those things work, together. And there's a lot of different connections between the gambling world. I will say this, my father died over 20 years ago now. I spent my life, paying and collecting from bookmakers and running money. And I'm not a gambler. I'm not saying that defensively. I'm just not. I did it with my father for as long as he was living. And I still have all that information and experience, but, I haven't bet a ball game, Charlie, since my father passed. It's just not of interest, to me. I don't want to ever be in a situation where I simply let go of the dice and cross my fingers and hope that everything works out. I was going to say I'm not a control freak, but anytime I say that, I realize I'm kind of saying I'm a control freak. I want to have all the information, have a grasp on all the variables and how that comes together within the collaboration, and always being prepared to, to pivot, because, the playing field changes, and this is probably better than anybody. The playing field changes in the film world constantly.
Constantly. And you back to Bruce Morrison. If I'm not correct, you guys met in fantasy baseball.
Yes, Bruce was and continues to be the commissioner of the longest running fantasy sports league in history. He started it in high school in in the early 80s. I'm going to say it may be getting close to 40 years. I joined him in the late 80s. So And one of the amazing things about Bruce, and I've told this story more than once. He was not only the commissioner of the league with sort of unilateral authority over management and decisions and trade vetoes and all that type of stuff. He was also a participant and continues to be a participant in the league. That is tricky because there's obviously an inherent conflict of interest there. But boy, from the first moment I met Bruce, that conflict doesn't exist. Bruce is he defines mensch, so having him at the table to be able to manage me, keep me on something of a leash, in terms of the finances. One downside, I guess, of growing up, at a crap table, so to speak, is money is ammunition, it's been difficult for me to pay attention to it. It comes in, it goes out. So, Bruce has been, there's no way I get out of the box without Bruce. And it's certainly not just on the business side. We've creatively collaborated together on just, most of the projects that I've been able to work on over the years.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And you also launched your way in a sort of a more of a contemporary period with a fair amount of not just films, but also unscripted work, like the stuff you were doing with Damon and all that. And very exciting. I go back in time because you and I connect back to Tom McCarthy and Station Agent on forward. I was looking back, I was kind of reminiscing back to that period and realized that we were sort of in parallel working with filmmakers like Tom McCarthy, Lee Daniels, Abel Ferrara, and Mitchell Lichtenstein, Boaz Yakin, the list goes on.
And I'm looking at and Darren as well. I worked on Black Swan as well, which I see over your shoulder.
Yes. Yeah, I was saying the other day to someone who asked me about my own career, and I said, well, unfortunately, one of the liabilities was I became a bit of a movie poster store after a while and don't have enough room for all of the stuff, quite frankly.
No, it's the same here, but let's talk about a champagne problem, Charlie.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about, speaking of business and all of that, let's talk a little bit about your years of sort of witnessing the different models for film financing and your sort of position. Because one of the things that I always marked on with you in terms of disposition was whether or not everyone else was out there trying to do all of these complicated debt deals against foreign sales. You were always pressing for a low budget, a sort of equity deal, equity only, a simpler way to handle the gamble. And I feel that there was such tremendous wisdom in that thinking. And I think also today, much of that sort of old school stuff that was going on with pre-sales is kind of dissolving anyway because of the changes that are going on. But talk a little bit about the generations of years that you dealt with films that were putting together their deals and how things are going now and all of the money aspect that you deal with.
Generations. Geez, I blink, Charlie. I've been doing this for 30 years. It's amazing, isn't it? And the world has changed. The playing field has changed. Obviously, Charlie, the equity finance model, really, as you know, only works with a certain level of budget. And most of my career, I have been operating in the low budget independent film world, which ranges, from little, $100,000, run and guns, under the ultra low budget, film agreement to to the Black Swans and the Preciouses of the world. So, but where my passion has been is really in the lower budget, world, in the station agent world. I won't reference that budget, but it was a tiny little budget, and it was a little film that could, for sure. What's most important in all of this, Charlie, and what I come back to, and I didn't create this, but transparency and equitable deals. That's what's most important. And that is easy, for me, and not so easy necessarily in the, in the industry. The more complicating the financing structure, the more likely it is that that there's someone that's getting, how do I say this politely, the shit end of the stick. And in those debt financed against pre-sales models where there's 2 or 3 different layers of of debt and, against the tax credit and against the estimates and the mezz piece and like that. There's a reason that behind closed doors, the equity that sits at the bottom of that is referred to as the dumb money, and that never sat well with me, so there are certain models that, are the more, at least in the past, the foreign sales driven models where the only folks that are really in a position of likelihood of recouping are the folks that are at top of the waterfall with the debt plays. So I had a distaste for those types of models simply because, more often than not, the equity was getting left out in the cold. So that the equity finance model, I'm going to talk a little bit about that further. It's tough to make that work with budgets over $2 million, and it necessitates having some wealthy, individuals or funds that understand and appreciate the nature of the risk. Every good investor agreement, Charlie, says you're going to lose your money, you're going to lose your money, you're going to lose your money. Make check payable to blank. Now, a little more eloquent and fleshed out than that. There's no riskier business than the film business. Maybe the restaurant business or used to be the theater business, but that may have pushed above the the independent film business. Folks need to get into it, understanding that sure, we're going to produce a film that has a likelihood of success in the marketplace, and we'll be as smart as we can in that regard. But, a lot of these films, aren't oriented towards appealing to the dumbest person in the back of the room. Not that every successful film is oriented that way, but, it's the reason that little films like Station Agent can get made. Can you imagine going out there and pitching Station Agent to a studio, back then, where with Pete as the lead? And I mean, it's just, who would look at that film? Like, that film only gets done, in my opinion, because of folks coming into it. Sure, they may have seen some commercial upside, but it's because they read this script. And I've got the original draft of the script sitting in my drawer over there. And they fell in love, and they realized, wow, not that it's a piece of art, but this is a wonderful little story, that's unusual and unique and would never get made in a studio. And that film, launched a lot of careers, Pete Dinklage already had a career in the business, but he was absolutely the leading man in that film. And I think folks, may have looked at him a little bit, differently, because it wasn't about, the film was not about his height. It was about his charm and his charisma and his wonderful performance and all that. And not to stick too much in the Station Agent, but boy, what an affair of the heart that was, Charlie. I mean, that was the first film that I did that anybody sort of saw, and it swept at Sundance and Broadway Bobby Cannavale and Patty Clarkson. I mean, it's just a wonderful group.
And it took off theatrically as well.
Oh, it sure did. And the old Miramax paid a good number for it. I cannot mention the Station Agent without mentioning Mary Jane Skalski, who I've been close friends with and have worked with as a lawyer and a collaborator. We produced films together. Mary Jane is as instrumental as anyone in terms of my career. And Tom also. Tom is a good guy and an incredibly loyal person. I worked with Tom on all his films until he landed, in studio land. He's been very loyal to the folks that, that he's worked with.
You were with him right through to Cobbler. I mean, before Spotlight. Yeah, absolutely amazing. Yeah, and with you had a funny story you once told me, and I've been close friends and compadres with Lee Daniels over the years, but I can't remember the exact thing, but you ran into him in a funny way. Tell the Lee Daniels story.
Oh God, there's so many Lee stories, and Lee also was such a privilege to have worked with him, and I mean, gosh, I wouldn't know where to begin with Lee. He is absolutely inimitable. He is a brilliant person, as folks know, and it was a struggle, for Lee, as brilliant as he is, and as many relationships that he built far before, well before he met me. Being a gay black man in the industry, back then, it was difficult for him to sort of penetrate, and obviously, with Shadowboxer and Tennessee on the directing side, he launched something between a career and a brand, at this point, So Charlie, I'm not sure what specific, story you're referring to. Lee and I had so many different, experiences.
Wasn't it when you were still in Soho when you met him, right? And he had Lee Daniels. He had Lee Daniels Entertainment, and he was not yet a director. He didn't become a director until Precious.
Yeah,
so he did that. He did.
Lee,
The Woodsman.
Absolutely. And I actually, the first time I met Lee, he sent in his advance team first when, you know, it was down at Soho, and that was the unbelievably talented and wonderful Lisa Cortez.
Right.
You know, Precious, she produced Precious. You know, no matter what the credits say, she is the force alongside Lee that made that film, you know, which was more than a film. It became a cultural phenomenon. That is Lisa Cortez. So Lisa came up first to my office, and we sat down, you know, sort of doing the prelim check to make sure it was kind of worth Lee's time. And then Lee came up and, you know, he plopped down. He had a, you know, his big afro at the time. And, you know, he basically, you know, said, "Who the fuck are you?" You know, more or less. And, you know, I think he presumed, like a lot of folks did, that I probably came from, you know, a background where my father was a lawyer, and I just got right into it, you know, and you know, and I think he recognized that I was probably a little different than most of the lawyers he had worked with before. And then there was this amazing sort of little thing that happened when Lee was downstairs waiting to come up. We were upstairs from the old Peter Beard gallery that was closing down at the time, and he was just sort of, you know, walking around the Peter Beard gallery, and you know, he mentioned he was down there, and he, you know, he saw some stuff that he liked. Meanwhile, at the time, I'm you know, I knew the guys. I knew Peter, and there was another fella that amazingly his name slips my mind, Peter Tunney, who's now become a very prominent artist. He used to run Beard's gallery, and you know, we had a relationship, and he owed me a few like that. So when I walked Lee downstairs, you know, we stepped into the Beard gallery, and I, you know, sort of whispered into Tunney's ear, you know, "Take care of Lee." And he basically just let Lee take what he wanted. So, you know, Lee took a, you know, couple of frames and like that. And, you know, it was an interesting way to meet Lee. And he did, you know, sort of look at me after that first meeting and, you know, said, "Who the fuck are you?" So we met on a very interesting basis. And it was really a wonderful, you know, collaborative relationship. And what a privilege it was to work with Lee, you know, and Lisa in those, you know, in those times. And Lee is, not to dwell too much on him, he is a force of nature, and is, you know, was so inspirational for me in terms of pursuing my dreams, because he had a dream and there wasn't nobody that was going to stop him. And here we are.
And here we are. And
Yeah.
here we are. So you got the opportunity to launch yourself film by film into more and more titles as counsel. And then at a time later, to skip forward, when you had the collaboration with Ron Perelman on Pottersville, tell me a little bit about the story behind that, because I heard a story about something that took place on the set that I think will, for me, go down in history. I don't know if you remember the story about Ron and the IATSE. Do you remember that?
Oh, sure. There's a ton of...
To me, this is one of the great independent filmmaking stories, because so many of the indie deals are SAG DGA.
Charlie, forgive me, my phone is ringing, oddly enough. I'm not sure what... All right, I think I took care of it.
And
I will talk to you about the... I'm sorry.
They approached the set. The eye came to the set.
Oh, no, I totally remember the story, and I'm happy to share it.
Fantastic.
I skipped over such a huge thing here. When I and I will get right back to Pottersville. You know, when I started the practice originally, you know, after I was working with Cowan Debates, you know, with Bruce Meyerson, you know, sort of running everything on the business side of things. I originally met a fellow named Robert Spinack, because this all started as Spinack and Gray. Rob was just out of Fordham Law School, which was my alma mater, and was working basically as an intern at the old Fine Line. So when Robert Spinack and I got together, we formed Spinack and Gray sort of overnight. You know, as we used to say, like, you know, I had the drugs, he had the street corners, which is to say we weren't selling drugs. I had the experience in the film industry, and he had the relationships. So we were able to start a practice working with folks like Ira Deutschman and Peter Newman and some real old guard, wonderful, you know, producers. And that's how the practice started. And then it expanded, you know, with Evan Krause. We became Gray Krause. And then it expanded beyond that. And Andre DeRoche and Josh Sandler and Ian Stratford and, you know, all the wonderful people that comprised, you know, the firm. Nicole Compass, who was, you know, we worked with me for many years. And that sort of built the foundation that all of this, you know, started from. And I don't want to leave them on the side, because we all built this together. Yeah. The opportunity that popped up with Ron, and talk about inimitable. Ron is a brilliant, beautiful, smart, funny, lovely, politically, I wouldn't say correct, but politically sort of on point dude. You know, I met Ron when he was putting through Jay Cohen, who's an agent at Gersh, and a really straight shooting good guy agent. You know, it was about putting together a film fund that was oriented towards making films in economically sort of distressed portions of New York, which was great. I'm a New Yorker, Ron's a New Yorker. So that's how that started. And it wasn't specifically about Pottersville. It was about putting together his Wing and a Prayer film group and production company with his partner, Josh Crook. So it started with me as a lawyer. And then, I fell in love with Ron and Josh, and the Pottersville opportunity, was something that existed before, Wing and a Prayer, and it just sort of came together. I was working with, with the writer, with Dan, the writer on that project. He was very close with Mike Shannon, and that's how it started. So working with, with Dan and Mike already being part of it in a very unusual role, because the film, which I like to think of as sort of like a stoner Capra movie. Mike was playing the Jimmy Stewart role, which is unusual for him to play in a very fantastic, unusual universe. And it was that sort of package with Mike on board, who's an actor magnet, that that was already there. Now the stars aligned because Ron was looking for projects in New York. This was set in Pottersville, basically New York to begin with. And, Mike was a big fan of, I should say, Ron was a big fan of Mike, and vice versa. And then the genesis came together. And boy, for a little, $2 million film, to have Mike Shannon and the great Ian McShane and Tom Lennon and Christina Hendricks and Judy Greer and gosh, I'm leaving out another star. But, once that came together, I won't say it was easy, but you have all those stars, even though the film was kind of bizarre and featured furries and all kind of weird elements. That came together in pretty quickly, and we shot it over the Christmas holidays. It must be 5 years ago at this point. The story you mentioned, we were making a $2 million film upstate, non-union. I am a believer in unions. However, there are certain situations where, because of union rules, it's very, very difficult to make a low-budget film. So none of this is posited in a manner that, there's anti-union. I say this sitting right upstairs from my Otzi, who's in my building.
I know. I love that.
So what you're referring to is the day I went off to Sundance, because we were in the middle of production, that's when the IA showed up. And Ron was there, sort of, general in the field. And he had, I forget his dog's name, but he'd walk his dog every night. And, one evening he and we all knew that it was a possibility the union was going to come in, and Ron saw a guy in a suit, and it didn't make sense, except maybe the guy was a union guy. So Ron and his, being Ron, approached the guy, and Ron can be very intimidating, as big a hearted guy as he is. And he basically said, "Who are you? Who are you?" And, we dealt with things very politely, and I have good relationships at the union. And, we had treated our crew, I like to think, very well. And the union didn't get the vote. And we moved on, in peace without the union. I will say the IA, and I have strong relationships there. I work closely with Dan Mahoney, and he was very much a gentleman about it. And, we got through that production because, Ron sort of in character, which is part him, basically said, "Not on my watch," and it worked, which doesn't always work with the union. But if you're in a room with Ron Perlman, again, he's imminently huggable, but he's also like, he's the real deal.
Well, he described it in a way that whether mythology or not, where he basically told them to get off his set.
Yeah, that kind of is what it boils down to, and he did so in a polite way.
Almost like, old school shotgun style, like, "Get off my set. We'll talk at another time. This is the wrong time to be doing this."
I think that, and yes, and again, I know that Ron dealt with it, professionally and politely.
Oh,
However,
yeah.
when you're standing across from Ron, it sort of comes with that,
Yeah. He was able to finesse that moment absolutely perfectly.
Yeah. When Ron steps in, it's not exactly like the Eastwood. I can't whistle, but like he comes with a sort of aura and theme music,
Yes, he does come with theme music for sure. Let's wind back the clock. I know very little about your early life growing up. You grew up in New York, in Queens, in one of the boroughs. Your dad, you said, as you mentioned, was a gambler and all that. Tell me a little bit about young Jonathan Gray.
Ha! Well, Charlie, I was actually born in Greenville, South Carolina.
You were not born in New York. Okay, even better.
Yeah, my parents were both in the Bronx and moved down to South Carolina in 1963, ostensibly for business reasons. Well, my father was always a gambler and a hustler. So as soon as he landed in South Carolina, he firmly embedded himself in the gambling world. And we were unusual. It was sort of the trifecta. We were from New York, which didn't go over that well in Greenville, South Carolina in the 60s. My father's a Jew and my mother's Irish Catholic. They're both passed now. So I as far as I know, am one of two Irish Jews from the great state of South Carolina. But growing up in the 60s there, I grew up across the street from Bob Jones University on Wade Hampton Boulevard. Bob Jones University, if you don't know, is the last desegregated school in the country. So it was an interesting atmosphere to grow up in, and one in which my mother would tell a story about being in a beauty parlor in 1963, and all of a sudden everyone sort of broke into applause, and she was wondering what was going on, and she heard people saying the president got shot, and she presumed it must have been the president of the mill or something. Of course, she didn't think it was nice anyway, but then she found out that they were applauding the assassination of JFK. Here's an Irish Catholic girl from the Bronx, So that was the sort of atmosphere in the South in the 60s. But I will say, and I'm not sure if you have to bleep this out, my father didn't give a shit about nothing. And I say that in a manner that, he really did give a shit about the important things. But, this goes back to the 60s, black, white, yellow, green, gay, straight. It didn't make any difference to him whatsoever. So putting my father in South Carolina in the 60s, he just kind of did he did what he did as a gambler. And ultimately, in a much longer story, Charlie, we left South Carolina in 1974 to be closer to my father, who at that point was in Danbury, a club federal penitentiary in Connecticut, serving with all the Watergate boys. Liddy was cellmate for a while.
Oh my God, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. Charlie, he became the first person convicted of organized crime in the country. That is a fact. Somehow, this high stakes professional gambler from the Bronx, became the first guy, convicted under the predecessor to RICO, the Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organization Act. Prior to that, there was something called the Omnibus Criminal Control and Safe Streets Act, which was, promulgated by Hoover, who always wanted to have some statute in place that was oriented towards going after organized crime, wise guys, racketeering like that. When they got, Capone, it was under tax laws. So they put together this statute that involved, and again, this is a longer conversation, a conspiracy of 5 or more people engaged in interstate commerce, which is what made it federal, and a violation of underlying state law, which is the gambling. So again, a longer conversation, but my father found himself right in the middle of that. I'm sitting across from a desk that has every bit of record and info. I got personal letters from J. Edgar Hoover to the U.S. Attorney in South Carolina, speaking about my father and how we're going to bring him down. I got all of it through Freedom of Information. That is, again, a longer story. But growing up in the South in the 60s, my first memory, Charlie, is literally hiding under a desk in our garden apartment in South Carolina with federal agents making their way into the house and standing on top of the desk I was hiding under, pulling down a drop ceiling to take out the wires, because wires back then were literally wires, because my entire life was tapped. I've got wiretap tapes in my desk that I got through Freedom of Information. So I wasn't aware of it as a kid. You just grow up in the environment you grow up in, and that's the context of your universe. Now people tell me their father's a dentist. I'm like, a dentist? That's insane. What was that life like? So I know I grew up in an unusual setting, but it was the setting I grew up in. I grew up in a world in which I would sit in the back seat of a car, at a Howard Johnson's, in Columbia, South Carolina, counting bags of cash as a 4-year-old. I kid you not. Even through law school, I'd go meet Jimmy or Basil, and I'd have, $80,000 in my pocket, and I had a safe deposit box. It was an unusual way to grow up. So table setting wise, Charlie, it's rich, and unusual. I grew up in casinos. The only time we ever traveled was to Vegas, to the islands, later to Atlantic City. if there wasn't a casino or gambling involved, there wasn't a vacation or a trip. And the only 2 days that didn't involve gambling, the only 2 days were the day before and the day after the Major League Baseball All-Star game. Those were the only 2 days, period, full stop. Baseball, football, basketball, every single game on the board, college included, in basketball and football. And that's what my father did. And again, this is a longer conversation, but basically it was arbitrage, Charlie. He was able to figure out that there was a disparity in the betting lines between bookmakers in different jurisdictions, and he found a middle position. He was buying low and selling high as part of the same transaction and turned the books on themselves, the bookmakers on themselves. Again, longer conversation. He did that forever. And that's why he went down, for the organized crime thing, because he was betting with bookmaking offices all over the country. Chicago, New York, California, South Carolina, Florida, because they all had different betting lines, right? So he was able to, bet the Jets in Miami and take 7.5 points. I know I'm getting a little bit inside baseball here, and bet the same game in New York and bet on the Dolphins and lay 4 points. You know what I mean? So that spread between 4 and 7.5 is where he lived. I can't help but get deeper into it. Yeah. The reason he was the target for the federal, action was because he was betting both sides of the ball games, Charlie. So he would bet 10,000 on the Jets and 10,000 on the Dolphins and just ride that middle position. So you look at a weekend on a Saturday afternoon with 51 college football games, he might have $10 million bet on the ball games. But guess what? $5 million's on each side of the game. So the only thing he's risking is what they call the VIG. I am getting far too inside baseball here. And basically was just turning the books upside down. And when the jury looked at the, at the numbers, it was like, oh my God, this guy's betting $10 million. The reality was he was risking 5% of that. And that was only if he didn't middle or side a game. And that is too detailed the description.
Wow.
But this, by the way, is also an environment in which the judge, John S. Martin in Columbia, South Carolina, in a sidebar with my father's counsel, said, I know the Jew did it. So this is the environment that he was, operating in. Right. And by the way, it just rolled right off him. He got a kick out of it. He enjoyed his experience in the Club Fed. He lost weight. He was eating 3 square a day. He was teaching Liddy how to play bridge. Anyway, I could go on and on.
Oh my God, obviously. It's fantastic. I hope there's a movie someday.
Charlie, I don't know if it's a movie or a book or a series or an interpretive dance piece. I have collected so much information, but like anyone else, it's so personal. It's tough to, I'm not shy about it, clearly. I've got 900 pages of transcript, sitting in my desk, Charlie. I spent, the better part of a year with a former paralegal named Adam Zenko, sitting in the backseat of a diner down in the financial district, just telling stories. And Adam was great. He would tell me when I was repeating myself, as you should. And then he took those transcripts and, took the tapes and transcribed them. And now I've got sort of a recitation of my entire life. I also, Charlie, and this is, everything's a longer story. Mm-hmm. I woke up one day in early March of 1998 with absolute urgency, that I finally needed answers to all the questions I had, with my father. And, I'll give you the truncated version of it, which is nothing short of a miracle in my life. I went to see my father and knew for whatever reason that I had to get answers to these questions. We had been working together on his story. I'm not a screenwriter, but I realized my way of getting inside with my father was positing it as if it was, a fictional story. Yeah. And he had a great idea for a movie, Charlie. This was after I had my first couple of films at Sundance, so I already had a little bit of experience. He had an idea about a movie about a professional gambler named Jack, his name and his profession, except in the movie, he didn't have a family or kids. So it ignored all the sort of serious elements. And instead of having a wife and kids, he had a brother that he magnanimously put, through law school and so on. So I went down to see my father with a tape recorder and a plan, which is I needed answers to all my questions. There was no more fooling around or politeness about it. And I went down there with a tape recorder and I asked my father a simple question, which is a great one to ask, in any sort of narrative film setting. Speaking of the character Jack, I said, all right, Jack goes into dinner. What does he order? He goes into a restaurant. What does he order for dinner? And my father, in his inimitable style, said, who gives a shit what Jack orders for dinner in a restaurant? I said, well, I'm not saying it's a scene in the movie, but if Jack is your central character, and this is a universe that you're creating, and you're the god of this universe, you sure as shit better know what Jack orders for dinner in a restaurant. If you expect an audience to believe this is a three-dimensional character, then you need to understand this character. And he understood exactly what I was saying. And I didn't waste any time, Charlie. I said, why is Jack a gambler? And his first, reaction was his parents died in a car accident when he was 15. It was bullshit. And I called him out on it. I said, died in a car accident? Like, what does that mean? Was it a Chevy? Like, what is, And then he paused and said, well, maybe it's easiest for me to just tell you about my own life. And that I took a swing, I made contact, and we spent the next, 3 days on tape. I came back with 9 hours of tape with answers to all the questions I ever had, Charlie, albeit posited in the context of this screenplay, where he would say, Jack's the dice table, and I throw the dice. It's like borderline schizophrenic. I took those tapes, got on a plane, and I never saw my father again. He died that night. Wow, listen to me. Of a heart attack in his sleep.
Holy shit.
Yeah, I mean, it's, talk about a blessed life, Charlie. I don't know where I would be if I didn't get all that information.
Wow.
So I am I've said this probably 8 times already. I'm just blessed in certain ways. So I have all of that. I've got, 400 pages of transcripts of conversations with my father and that struggle to get all the information and to bring it quite literally home. So, all that is, and thanks for making me misty-eyed again, Charlie. All that is sitting in a drawer right over there. Oh, there's Dean Martin. Right over there. And I will find the time, to do it. And this sort of COVID time has given us all an opportunity to slow down a little bit and contemplate a lot of stuff in our lives. And at some point I'll get to that, Charlie, and you cut me off if I'm going on too much.
No,
Charlie.
I love it. And I'm glad you referred to what's going on right now, because that's actually a transition I wanted to make anyway. Listen, this is the new normal where we are right now. I mean, oh my God, new normal, right? But it's,
forgive me, Charlie, for 1 second. I'm so sorry. I have to use, I don't know what you do in this. I have to use the restroom. Can we take a break for a minute? What do I do?
I guess we can take a break. I'm going to have to.
I can leave this rolling, but I have to, other than, having an embarrassing moment, I just got to run for 1 minute.
Well, we'll walk with you and we'll figure it out. Yeah.
Well, I'll walk with you, but I'm going to leave you outside the restroom.
Yeah.
And if we can, this must have happened before in your other wonderful interviews.
Yes.
Charlie, forgive me. I'm going to leave you here for 1 minute. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back, Charlie. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
When nature calls, there's very little you can do about it.
All right, so let's. This is going to be an interesting moment. I'm actually, while you're doing this, I'm making a coffee, which is fantastic. And,
good. Well, this is an opportune moment. I'm going to. Should I transition out of the office? Can I just walk to a different location?
Well, wherever you want to go, as long as we're continuing the cast. So yeah,
we shall do that.
I am going to.
All right, I am walking down the hall here, Charlie. I'm going to sit in the conference room for a bit.
Okay, changing locations, changing the setting. There we go. There you go. Back in.
All right.
Yeah, this is going to.
Setting looks familiar, Charlie.
This is going to drive my my dear Olivier slightly crazy, but that's the way it goes.
Olivier's used to me driving him crazy, Charlie.
Oh, good.
All right. Sorry about that. We were back.
You flashed before you went to the restroom. You flashed Dean Martin, which I know for me is an icon of a tremendous interest of yours, which is the Rat Pack in general. Correct? I mean, you have a tremendous interest in the era of Sinatra, Sammy Davis, Dean Martin, and Vegas, and all of that stuff. Right? Those stories.
Yeah, I having grown up in casinos my whole life, it's a natural. I had the privilege of meeting Mr. Martin when I was a young boy. The casinos that we would stay at, coincidentally, were the Sands and later the MGM, which happened to be Dino's haunts back then. So I met him in passing as a child. I was just sort of doe-eyed, but and Sinatra, I'm not a music person per se, but I grew up with Sinatra vinyl. You know, it was just there. You know, my father liked, Sinatra, although he always had a beef with Sinatra, who apparently flirted with my mother, a little bit too strong, back in the 70s. But that notwithstanding, I had Sinatra records there, and I kind of fell in love with that music as well. Like, there was just something that sort of carried me. It's kind of a timeless thing. And, I still have the Sinatra library, in my head, Charlie. And, the Dean Martin of it all, and I can't get too deep into this because it's, it's something that the project we have in development, but, fortuitously, I actually met the representative of the Dean Martin estate about a year and a half ago or so. And, over the course of the next, several months, working with the trustee and other folks, including Bruce, et cetera. I'm actually the first person they've ever granted exclusive access to all the assets of the Dean Martin estate. So I'm currently developing a docu-series about Dean Martin called The Invention of Cool. And I'm going to err towards the side of being, conservative. I don't want to talk too much about it. It's still a project in development. But boy, it gave me an opportunity to dive, deeply into, Dean Martin and the Rat Pack, of course, and learning a lot about, the era, because Dean Martin, in particular, Dean Martin brought that incarnation of the Rat Pack together. The Rat Pack actually goes back to Humphrey Bogart and like that. The Rat Pack we know, as you said, is Dean and and Frank and Sammy and Peter Lawford and a couple of the others. They were the core group that came together. It was Dean Martin, after he broke up with Jerry Lewis, that that decided he didn't want to just have the spotlight himself. He had launched a successful career in Vegas and in films, but he put the call into Frank, and that was the impetus for starting that era of the Rat Pack. There's a couple of things about Dean Martin. I think it's more than just the music and the era and that appeal for me. When I had the privilege of sitting down with the trustee of the estate, which we did at the Polo Lounge at the Beverly Hills Hotel and Dean's booth, like just amazing to be there. One of the first questions she asked me was what was it about Dean Martin that appealed to me? And back to my dad, I quoted my father, who didn't have that many life lessons to share with me, but the ones he did really stuck with me. And one of the things he said to me was, and this is out of context, but he'd say, Jonathan Gray, then I knew he was serious. He'd say, Jonathan Gray, I don't give a shit if it's the plumber or the king of Siam. It doesn't make a shit of difference to me. Listen to that. I don't give a shit if it's the plumber or the king of Siam. It doesn't make a shit of difference to me. I mean, philosophically, that is where I live. Like, so much of what I'm saying feels self-serving, so forgive me that, but I don't give a shit if it's the plumber or the king of Siam. I am as likely, for better or worse, to forget the movie star as I am the janitor, like, and vice versa, and that is such a fundamental philosophy, that drives my life, Charlie, and the community that we, managed to bring together is so diverse and so eclectic. It's not just big shots or little shots or shots at all, So right. That's one thing that, when I said that to Laura, the trustee, we both got, I'm clearly a weepy guy. We both got, touched. He said, that was Dean. When Dean Martin used to, sit in the Polo Lounge and all the celebrities would come and fawn all over him because he was Dean Martin, he wasn't the least bit interested. He just wanted to talk about the Dodger game with the busboys. That's another way of saying it. And that meant the world to me. The other thing that resonated was, and this one is quite simple and mildly obscene, life lesson. He'd say, Jonathan Gray, don't give anyone a reason to fuck with you. How's that for a life lesson? Jonathan Gray, don't give anyone a reason to fuck with you. And that also, is a great philosophy. And it's a complex, sort of analysis that goes into landing at a place where no one's going to screw with you. I shared that with Laura as well. And it kind of was, Dean Martin was almost impossible in certain respects. He transcended, film and television and stage and music. I mean, he kind of had it all. But what impressed me, probably most about Dean Martin, when they were, together as the Rat Pack, and if you do a little research, you'll see a lot of folks think that Kennedy never gets elected. Back to JFK, Kennedy never gets elected if not for the Rat Pack, and the support that they gave him.
Mm-hmm.
And, Frank was obviously, tied to certain mob connections and so on. And there's a story about, one of the events that they held, promotional event for JFK. And even though Dean may have, been fine with the politics of JFK, these were events that were organized and supported by the mob. And there's one story where it's Dean on stage with Sammy and Frank, and Sam Giancona, who was like the head of all the families at the time, is in the audience. And before the show started, Dean looks right at Giancona and points at him and says, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for him," and points to Sinatra. Wow. I mean, that's not cojones. That's a next level to be able to look that guy in the eyes and say, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm not into that. I'm doing it for him." And somehow they never screwed with him because he just transcended all of it. So obviously I'm enthused and excited about doing this because it's more than just a biopic about Dean Martin. He was a very mysterious person, but it is covering, culturally the history of this, I'm going to say it, once great nation, and will be again, from, the 40s through the 80s, from pre-Jerry through the Cannonball Run years. So here I am inadvertently pitching it, but I'm really excited about it.
But one of the foundations for the image of the Rat Pack, it was an image of these guys together, freedom, pleasure, a lifestyle.
Yeah.
All of the components of the image that they represented, a little bit of, I don't want to say enfant terrible, but a little bit of they're the anti-heroes. They're the naughty guys that you love, right? Am I right?
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I mean, and as an aside, Dean Martin wasn't the drinker that everyone thought he was. I mean, that was all a facade and part of the act. There's a term that came up in Dean Martin land, which I didn't coin. It may have been Nick Tosches who wrote a book about him. I'm going to probably mispronounce it. Forgive me, my Italian friends. Menefregismo, which basically means I don't give a shit. It's just sort of a carefree attitude that you're referring to. Now, I say that, in a manner that this didn't suggest he didn't care about people or anything, but it's just like, I'm going to do what I do. I have a path to follow, and I'm going to do it. And I don't give a shit about any of the other variables. That doesn't mean you can't lead a true and honorable life. But you know what? I was going to say I don't give a shit. I do. That's to say I really do. But I've chosen a path, Charlie, that I've kind of done my thing. Which has not been alone. It's been with an incredible community. But I haven't gone a traditional path because I feel like I've had that strength, whether bestowed upon me by my parents or even to a certain extent sort of being a fan of the Sinatra and Dinos of the world back then. But we all are the result of all these influences.
I mean, I think not to coin a song. I do it my way. You've done it your way, for sure. Yeah.
While being young at heart.
While being young at heart.
Fairy tales can come true, Charlie.
It
can happen to you.
So back to COVID-19 before we roll off into the sunset together, because it is important that we talk about the now and the new normal, because obviously, I've been doing this podcast now for over a year of recording, and we did all of them in studio, and everyone was enjoying all of our freedoms. And now what is quite interesting is, and I didn't sort of feel it when it first hit before I started to do the podcasts on Zoom. I started to realize, well, wow, the whole world just opened up to me. I can do one of these with a guy in London, a guy in Hong Kong, a guy in LA, someone in Europe, and do it all from my home and create content. I think to myself for a moment now, we're in a strange world. And as you commented in our last conversation when you were talking about the changes that have taken place, even for you within both producing and as an attorney, going to focus from narrative to documentary was just kismet for you guys. I mean, narrative has come for a moment anyway to a bit of a standstill. There's a hunger for a new pipeline of content. People who shot stuff can continue to cut away, like the projects I've been working on, but the demand will need to be met when there's been a long space of narrative content not happening, and we're in a very strange environment right now, and we have to see daylight off in the future. But the first thing that comes back inevitably is unscripted and documentary, which you're focusing on. It's become,
I mean, I pivoted my career, back at the beginning of this year to really working almost exclusively on documentaries, which, was kind of dumb luck in terms of the state of affairs right now, because the docs are still chugging along. As you say, particularly the archivally driven docs, there's a natural social distancing in the post process that, accommodates that. And I haven't figured out, and as far as I know, no one's figured out exactly what the next step is in terms of physical production. I hear about, quarantining crews and cast for a certain period of time, but there's a lot of fallacies in that logic. Charlie, it's a brave new world, and I surely haven't, figured it out. I hear a lot of folks talking about this need for content, and of course, and at the same time, there's a whole glut of product, that didn't go through Cannes, at least not the Cannes that we know, or, South by or Tribeca. So the marketplace is kind of weird right now, to say, the least. I have been focusing, independent of what's going on in COVID land, on documentaries, and I sort of, am in a good position to continue advancing those projects, now.
yeah.
I am still lawyering, and I'm starting to see, social distance guidelines and production sort of, guidelines being promulgated at this point by the Netflixes and the HBOs of the world and so on. But, nobody's, quite figured it out yet. I mean, there's just, too many real world sort of variables to, that aren't fixed yet to, to be able to even make a responsible and intelligent decision about, how to get back into production,
Yeah. And, we wind back the clock to our relationships with the early icons of independent distribution, like Ira Deutschman, who you mentioned before, Bob Burney, the late Bingham Ray, Jeff Lipsky, all of the people who were part of the forefront of independent distribution going back in the Weinstein, Cinecom, Fine Line era. And here we are today with, I think, theater chains potentially at risk.
Yeah, theatrical. God knows. I mean, how they've even survived this, this layoff, Charlie. But
AMC, how does it work? It's like what comes back. There's one independent cinema that's talking about it. Now we're in the mixed theater. I love it. We're in the Atmos stage.
All right, let me see if I can. There we go.
Moving around, I love it. We're in a gigantic studios facility tour. I love it. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we're in a transition now, and certainly streaming content is on fire. So the demand is there. And all of the new channels are popping one at a time, whether it's the NBC Universal's newer version that they're calling Peacock or HBO Max, and every player is in the game, and it's ironic that some of them, not all of them, because obviously Amazon, Netflix, and others have Disney Plus have already launched. There's some that are just in the process of launching their networks. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is, and it's a constant. I mean, it's one of the reasons the industry is interesting, because it's constantly in flux. Whether it's a new platform coming to bear, or a new manner in which information is conveyed. I'm a simple person. Like, ultimately, what it comes down to, and this is as simple as pie, is content is such a broad term. Put the work in. I've seen so many pitches over the years where they're kind of thoughtless, like, spending the time to make sure that whether it's a feature or a limited series or a series, just you figure out how to crack that code, so to speak, before you land in front of the buyer, and making sure that you have a grasp on who your audience is. If you're intending to go down a commercial route, figure out who the market is first. I'm not saying that you should blindly cater to the market, but so much of it comes down to doing the work and presenting the project in a manner that convinces folks that not only, is the project interesting, but that you can deliver on it, and what better way to do that than, creating a deck that actually is, goes beyond just clip art and misspelled, copy, that part of it I always come back to, and it's a very simplistic approach, is spending the time doing the research, doing the work, understanding your audience. And it's just such a fundamental part of the process that gets brushed to the side sometimes. And it does make a difference to spell the person's name right who you're sending the package to. It does make a difference to format things properly, so spending the time and paying attention to that. And, like I wouldn't be here if I hadn't surrounded myself over the years with people smarter than I am. I couldn't do what Bruce Meyerson does. I couldn't do what Brian Devine does, or, Jason Orens or Pamela Ryan at Gigantic. All these folks are contributing. So that, is probably the best advice anyone could give, is to surround yourself with folks who are better at stuff than you are, whatever it happens to be. It's not different than stepping out to the making of the film and hiring a cinematographer. I couldn't shoot a movie, nor could I act in a movie.
Right on. And apropos of the filmmakers in your history, we have people that are very close to you within the Gigantic family, like Josh Zeman,
sure.
And then producers like Eisen Robbins with Blue Caprice, and films like that are like sort of important landmark moments, and Cropsey that was done by Josh. There's a family, and you have been the in a sense sort of the leader in that world for years.
I'm not just knee-jerking this. I'm not sure about I've been a leader at that world. I have been a facilitator, Charlie, and I'd like to think I've created a you know what, I know that I created a space that people feel safe in, that they don't feel like they're going to get their pockets picked, not literally, but sort of broader than that, and that sometimes just involves lighting some candles and creating a space that people feel comfortable in, So that's been my great privilege, Charlie. I gotta, and we're probably coming short on time. I want to thank you for wearing that First Amendment T-shirt, because that's where everything comes back to. And if you can't read it, and I don't need to look at it, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, Charlie. Right?
Correct.
It's so important. And those last two stanzas are just as important. The right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's what we do. It really is what we do in terms of working in the arts. And that part of it is, as important as anything else. It's why it's, I would take one more walk if we get a complete tour of the office here. But those words are emblazoned, as you walk into this office, you can't get past a 9-foot, First Amendment. So to watch this podcast, if what they take from it is get to know the First Amendment and how important it is, particularly in these troubled times.
Absolutely.
Then there'll be some value from this. Yeah. There she is, Charlie.
Ah, there she is, right at the front door of the law firm. The First Amendment done in beautiful calligraphy. You know how we're going to roll this podcast out, though,
What's that?
You know how we're going to finish the podcast, right? You're going to sing for me.
I don't mind singing, Charlie. And I thought about it a little bit because, there's a little something called copyright law, and for example, singing a Sinatra track, it's actually an issue theoretically under copyright law, but I figured out a way through it. It's one of the basic fundamentals in documentary film, which is where I'm living these days, is fair use.
Yeah.
It's copyright law. Guess what? Sometimes runs right into the face of the First Amendment and freedom of speech and all that. So as long, generally speaking, as you're using copyright material in a different context, with some commentary and criticism, then you can kind of get away with it.
Yeah. And we love Frank, and the amount of nights at the law firm, and of course at our old favorite location, Circuit Tobacco, now Soho Cigars, there were moments of real crooning that happened, and I would be remiss in not having a moment where the man himself would give us a little demonstration of this.
Charlie, I am happy to sing a couple of notes. I'm going to go right back to the song that has inspired and influenced me, for most of my life. And I am singing this song in the context of providing, some commentary about the industry and some commentary about how one maintains inspiration. This is just me setting the table for the fair use. Yeah. How one maintains inspiration, moving forward in the industry. And it goes something like this, Charlie. Fairy tales can come true. It can happen to you if you're young at heart. For it's hard, you will find, to be narrow of mind if you're young at heart. And if you should survive to 105, look at all you'll derive out of being alive. And here is the best part. You had a head start if you are among the very young at heart. A very abridged, brief version within the bounds, I think, of fair use protection under copyright.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I vote yes. I vote yes. Charlie votes yes.
Apologies to anybody who may be watching this. I am not a singer. I am clearly a ham.
Oh, no, but the best of all hams. Love you so much. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And I know that there'll be lots of people who will enjoy to watch this little exchange here that we had today. It was tremendous. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlie. My privilege to have been here, and I'll see you soon in real life, I hope.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, brother.
All right, Charlie. Thank you.